The only light that ever touched the sump was the color of a fresh wound. It pulsed from the emergency strobes, casting long, dancing shadows across the cavernous chamber and glinting off the rising, scummy water. Luka adjusted the battery pack on his shoulder, the beam from his headlamp cutting a clean white line through the crimson haze. Before him, immense and silent, sat the reason he was down here, the Great Filter. It was a perfect sphere of rust-wept plasteel and tangled conduits, big as a hab-block and just as dead. Or it was supposed to be. For a century, the first-generation water cycler had sat dormant, a monument to the first 100 colonists. But now, with the primary grid failing, the warrens were flooding. The water, thick with industrial runoff and recycled waste, was already sloshing over the corroded gantry he stood on. From below, a deep, rhythmic thump vibrated through the metal as a large, dark shape bumped against a support pylon. "You sure about this, Ren?" Luka muttered into his comms, the speaker a cheap, scavenged thing buzzing against his jawbone. "The schematics don't lie, Luka," Ren's voice crackled back, tinny with distance. "There's an auxiliary pump, manual activation. The merchant house wants it running. They don't like their lowest warehouses getting wet. And they're paying? Enough for you to get your kid that lung filter upgrade. Enough for a month of clean air. Just turn the wheel, Luka. Get it done." The comm clicked off. A month of clean air. He started to cross the gantry, his worn boots slipping on the wet metal. The thump echoed again from below, closer this time. Best not to think about it. He reached the filter's main hatch, a heavy cog-shaped wheel crusted with a century of neglect. It groaned open with a shriek of tortured metal, and a blast of air hit him, cold and smelling of decay and copper. He swung himself inside. The schematics on his datapad showed a forest of iron, but the reality was more grotesque. Pipes as thick as his body were coated in a slimy, phosphorescent mold, casting a faint, sickly green light. It looked less like a machine and more like the rotting corpse of one. He followed the faded yellow line painted on the floor, his headlamp beam piercing a darkness that felt ancient. He found the pump room in the sphere's core. The air here was thick, heavy with the coppery tang of decay. The chamber was dominated by a colossal piece of machinery, and set into its side was the manual override, a bright red wheel, 2 meters in diameter, crusted over with what looked less like rust and more like calcified biosludge. It wouldn't budge. He put his shoulder to it, heaving until black spots danced in his vision. The wheel felt anchored, not just heavy, as if the machine's dead heart had fused to its ribs. His cheap cybernetic hand whined, its actuator straining uselessly. From outside the hatch, he heard the gurgle of the rising water, a sound like a giant drowning. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He fumbled with his comms. "Ren, it's seized, solid, fused." Only static answered, punctuated by a wet, rhythmic slapping sound from the water below. He was alone. The image of his daughter's face swam before him, her small chest rattling with each breath. He could almost hear the ghostly rasp in his ear, the sound that haunted his sleep. No pump, no pay. No pay, no filter. The thought was no longer a motivation, it was a verdict. His wild eyes, reflecting the crimson emergency light, darted around the chamber. His gaze fell on a long, thick maintenance pipe running along the ceiling, already groaning under its own weight where a support bracket had rusted through. It was a madman's gambit. It was his only chance. Working with a frantic energy born of pure terror, he unhooked the heavy battery pack from his shoulder, using its strap and a hook from his belt to create a makeshift pulley. He looped it over the weakened pipe, then attached the other end to a spoke on the great wheel. He took a deep, shuddering breath, braced himself, and pulled with all his might on the pipe itself. The bracket shrieked, groaned, and then snapped with a deafening crack. The pipe sagged, its immense weight wrenching down on the pulley. The strap creaked, stretched, and held. With a sound like grinding continents, the red wheel turned, just a centimeter. It was enough. As he threw his entire weight into it, a deep, shuddering groan echoed up from the very bedrock of the station, a cacophony of metal screaming against metal. It was the sound of a machine waking up. A terrible, rhythmic thump began, vibrating through his bones. The heart of the Warrens was beating again. He stumbled back out onto the gantry, his heart hammering in time with the station's new pulse. The water below was churning, swirling into a newly opened drain, the level already visibly dropping. The red strobes continued their silent, rhythmic pulse, but now they seemed to be keeping time with the monstrous heartbeat he'd unleashed. He had won. He turned his back on the great filter and began the long walk back to the upper levels, to Ren, and to his pay, to a month of clean air. In the Warrens, that was the same as a lifetime.